Hello everybody, and welcome to my webinar, Could I Be Autistic? A free webinar for the self-diagnosed and wondering. We've been doing this for a couple of years every Autism Acceptance Month, and there have been a lot of requests to record it, so finally I'm recording these slides, and then our plan is to offer live workshops every April. First off, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Lucas Harrington, a psychologist here at the University of Washington Autism Center, and I also did training at the University of Washington's Len Fellowship. I'm autistic myself, and although I wasn't officially diagnosed until almost 30, I've been involved with the neurodiversity and autism acceptance movement since college, so over 10 years now. Over the years, I collected virtually the full set of co-occurring conditions and misdiagnoses you often see with autism: depression, anxiety, ADHD, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and eating disorder, and possible seizures that were probably really more of a meltdown or a shutdown. Some of these diagnoses still seem to be accurate, and some of them were just straight up wrong. The possibility of autism got blown off at least twice before I finally saw an expert. I was told that if I was autistic, I couldn't have such good perspective-taking skills, show emotion, or laugh at neurotypical humor. Pretty much everyone in the field who actually knows me well seems to be confident that my autism diagnosis is 100% correct, so clearly there are a lot of inaccurate stereotypes out there, even among people who consider themselves autism specialists. Before we dive into the information, I want to acknowledge the sad reality that autistic and otherwise neurodivergent adults are often really having to struggle for resources. I know that not everybody here is necessarily autistic, but people usually don't wonder if they're autistic unless they're neurodivergent in some way. And I will have some information for you at the end about help that you can get even without an autism diagnosis. If you think you may need support, if painful memories or current worries come up, please write down one of the resources here so that you have it available. 1-800-273-TALK is a crisis phone line. Texting HOME to 741-741 gets you a text-based crisis line. 1-877-565-8860 is the trans lifeline for gender-diverse people who need support, crisis or otherwise. And warmline.org has resources if you're not in crisis, but could just use a supportive listener. So please pause the video and note down the resources if you would like, and then we will begin. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what autism actually is. Not just the current diagnostic criteria, although I will be covering that, but also how autistic people see and experience it ourselves. Autism is a neurotype, meaning a way in which the brain can be structured. If you have autism, ADHD, and so on, those are all considered neurotypes. If you don't have any neurological diagnoses, that means you have the most common neurotype, which is referred to as being neurotypical. Some people don't like to talk about neurotypes as disabilities, like they say, it's just a difference. Autistic people would thrive with proper accommodation. But in my view, that doesn't make us different from other disabled people. If you have no arms, you can thrive with proper accommodation. If you have Down syndrome, you can thrive with proper accommodation. I have lots of differences from the average person, like I enjoy doing algebra and I can touch my tongue to my nose. But unlike those two, some of my differences need accommodation, and those are the differences that are also disabilities. And I always tell people, disability doesn't mean that you're broken or that you can't do things. It means that you deserve credit for all of the obstacles that you've had to deal with. Autism is not necessarily 100% genetic, but we do know that it's very genetic. Sometimes a genetic mutation just happens out of nowhere, but very often if one person is autistic, then they have autistic family members. At this point, it's my policy that if I'm diagnosing someone, then I provide information in case anyone else in the family wants to look into it. And we used to think of autism as meaning that there was something wrong with you, as if it was damage to the brain. But more and more we're learning that it's really more of a different operating system. So like Mac versus PC or Switch versus Xbox, you don't take your Xbox into the store saying, why isn't this portable? Why can't I play Pokemon? Or if people aren't technical, I use dog breeds. If you want a pet you can carry around, you probably aren't going to get a husky. But if you want a working dog who can pull a sled, you probably aren't going to get a Chihuahua. So it's not like there's a best dog breed. It all depends on the situation. It's the same thing with neurotypes. But unfortunately, if your neurotype is pretty rare, as far as we know right now, autistic people are less than 5% of the population, then most situations are going to expect you to be good at different things than you're good at and need different supports than you actually need. So on the left here is the DSM-5 criteria, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, which is the book that lays out the current defining criteria for different diagnoses. And as you can see, it's very focused on what we have a hard time with. Reciprocity means the back and forth of interaction. Do we have conversations similar to other people, or show interest in the ways that they're expecting? And empathy is also part of reciprocity. Research shows that autistic people on average have just as much empathy as other people in terms of how much we care, but we may have a hard time figuring out what people want or need from us. In nonverbal communication, things like eye contact, facial expressions, tone of voice, a lot of times will look different in those areas unless we put a lot of effort into hiding it, sometimes even then. And it's often, although not always, hard for us to read other people's nonverbal communication. And finally, the interpersonal relationships. You'll see sometimes where someone misses out on a diagnosis because the professional says, "Oh, you can't be autistic, you're happily married, or you have good friends." But for all of these, what we're actually seeing is difficulty with typical expectations. What we're discovering is that autistic people often naturally interact in a way that is very satisfying for other autistic people. And we often have traits that even neurotypicals may find unusual but valuable, like being sincere and outside-the-box thinking. So when someone is a good parent or a good partner or a good friend, that isn't even necessarily in spite of the autism. It may even be in part because of the autism. And then the other part of the diagnostic criteria is what we call the restricted and repetitive behaviors. There's actually so much that we don't know about the science of autism. We don't really know why all of these things go together. For a diagnosis of autism, you need to have or have had all of the social criteria on the previous slide, and at least 2 of these here. So the first criterion in this section is what we call stereotyped behavior. And this is a big umbrella that covers a lot of different things that don't really seem to go together, other than the fact that they all just sort of look autistic when you know what you're looking for. So things like flapping your hands, spinning, lining up objects, repeating phrases off of TV, even sounding like what people often refer to as a little professor or a walking textbook all falls under this same category. And they used to think that all of this was a distraction and a waste of time, but now we're learning that it can be, not us, we knew, but they're learning that it can be really valuable, like as a creative or calming activity. The second criterion is what they call rigidity. I like to also call it precision. We're often very sensitive to noticing that things are different from usual, and it can really throw us off, but the sensitivity is actually valuable for certain jobs. Like there are areas where autistic people thrive if they're the type who love doing the exact same thing every day that would make other people bored, or it's valuable to notice that tiny details are different from what you were expecting. I always say it if a surgeon is cutting you open and they go, "Oh, that isn't really what I was expecting to see." You don't want the laid-back surgeon who goes, I'm sure it's fine, let's keep moving. You want the person who's not going to let it go until they know exactly why this is happening. But we can get in our own way sometimes when we know that something isn't important, but we still can't stop stressing about it. And the third criterion is the intense interests. And there's this myth that autistic people just have their one thing. Like you have the train guy who's all about trains, and he has been ever since he was the little train boy. A lot of us actually have many different special interests, and no one thing is a dominating obsession. But the interests might be unusual, like for some reason vacuum cleaners are very popular. And they don't have to be obsessed with vacuum cleaners. For a child to be passionate about vacuum cleaners at all is pretty unusual. Or they might be interested in something very common. Like this is especially something you see with autistic girls, where they're into horses, and people go, "Oh, that's not an autistic thing, she's just a horse girl." But she's talking about horses so much that all of the other horse girls are sick of it. Or she only wants to talk about some very specific part of it, like horse genetics or only Clydesdale horses. So it's hard to find other girls who want to engage in the same way. A lot of times we have a way of interacting with our interests that's different from how a lot of neurotypical people do their passions, where we have this kind of collecting or memorizing or cataloging sort of approach. And I think this criterion is the easiest for people to see as a strength because it can be a career thing. The guy who invented Pokemon is autistic, and his thing was bug collecting, so he brought the joy of collecting to the world. The actor Dan Aykroyd is autistic. He made Ghostbusters because he's into ghosts. He made Blues Brothers because he's into blues. And a lot of creativity is about making new connections. So someone who sees everything through the lens of their special interest may make breakthroughs that are out of reach to someone who's leaving the topic at the office when they clock out. Not to mention the emotional piece of the interests. Few things are more socially rewarding to me than meeting someone who wants to talk about my special interests at the level of depth that I do. A lot of times I find that neurotypicals think when we're sharing about our interests, we want people to just listen and ask questions. But really the most exciting thing for me is when someone else has new facts or analysis about the topic. That is an incredibly special connection for me. And finally, we have the sensory differences. This can look like being oversensitive, like you're really bothered by noise or smells or clothing, or you can be undersensitive, like you can't feel when you're injured or hungry or you need to use the bathroom. And undersensitive people might also do sensation seeking, like crashing into things or chewing on things in order to get some feeling. You can even be both oversensitive and undersensitive at once, or even oversensitive and undersensitive in the same sense. So the classic example is people who feel pain from light touch. And other people go, "You said you don't like being touched, but I saw you asking someone to hug you tightly, so obviously you were lying when you said you don't want to be touched." But for them, the deep pressure might feel totally different. And these sort of paradoxical effects or subtle differences are really common. And the other way to look at this is that the difficulties are a side effect of having special perceptual gifts. I have a friend who has the exquisite sensitivity in terms of being able to enjoy subtle sensory experiences, and he does not have any unpleasant sensory hypersensitivities as far as I know. So that's the dream for all of us, but it is not usually what we get. However, research has shown that we do often have gifts, like in music or in visual perception. So to help people understand this experience, I use the metaphor of the spam filter. If you're neurotypical, your brain basically has a spam filter like in your email. Subconsciously, your brain takes all of the information and goes, okay, that's not important, that's not important, that's not important. Here are the small handful of things that you need to consciously process. Whereas when you're autistic, or also if you have ADHD, you don't have that filter. So you are just getting a ton of raw information at once, which is great in some ways because you have a ton of data for noticing patterns, and you pick up on things that neurotypicals mistakenly filtered out as unimportant. But sometimes your inbox gets so filled up that you're just like, forget it, I am not processing any of this, and you just throw it all in the trash. And that's where the meltdowns can happen. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network has come up with their own definition of autism, which you can see overlaps a lot with the DSM-5 criteria, but is a lot less judgmental. They also call out differences in movement, like difficulty controlling our hands or our mouths, which is pretty common for autistic people, but not part of the official criteria. Neuroclastic also came up with their own interpretation, including a more detailed take on how exactly we react to social information differently. It's generally pretty consistent with what I've observed in people. They also talk about autistic inertia. When we're not doing something, it's hard for us to start, and when we are doing something, it's hard to stop. So not everybody's going to have all of the characteristics listed on any of these slides, but these are just some common themes that you're going to see a lot. So now for the main event, let's talk about self-diagnosis of autism. So first off, I'm going to be providing information about how testing works in case you want to look into that. Unfortunately, we cannot provide you an assessment at this time. We recognize that there's a huge gap in services for adults, and we are always looking for ways that we can help this very underserved community. I'm hoping that this webinar will be helpful to you. We here at the University of Washington Autism Center absolutely support self-diagnosis. That doesn't mean that I'm 100% of the time going to agree. I occasionally see people where it seems like something else is creating signs similar to autism, like maybe they're uncomfortable with eye contact because of anxiety, or they have a sensory processing disorder, but overall they seem to have a pretty strong sense of conventional social intuition. Anxiety or trauma and ADHD can cause effects that look a lot like autism, and in particular you can have sensory hypersensitivity without autism. But I will tell you, it is extremely rare for me to meet someone who I think has self-diagnosed incorrectly. It is way, way more common that I agree that they're autistic, but other professionals have been blowing them off. A lot of things may look like autism from the outside, but it's less common for other things to feel like autism from the inside. And a lot of the autistic community supports self-diagnosis as well, for reasons that I'm about to talk about. Lots of people who absolutely qualify for an autism diagnosis can't get one, or don't want it in their medical record. And at the end, I'll be providing some online and local communities that will welcome you if you're self-diagnosed or wondering. First off, there are plenty of legitimate reasons to worry about stigma if you get a formal diagnosis. It's possible that people with biases against autism might gatekeep you, keeping you out of things like the military or foster parenting. And I do have personal experience applying to be a foster parent. In my case, the agency didn't seem to have any concerns about the autism, but I did have a doctor who was resistant to signing off on it, even though everyone else thought I was qualified. So just a single prejudiced person can cause you a lot of headaches. And someone might try to use it against you in something like custody or divorce proceedings. So for a lot of people, the diagnosis is a net positive. It certainly has been for me. But you do need to think carefully about the possible outcomes. If you do want a formal diagnosis, there are often so many barriers to getting one. It's very expensive if insurance isn't paying well. It's hard to figure out where to go and how to navigate all of the paperwork. Things like transportation may be a problem. You may feel very anxious about dealing with the doctors, or you may have very legitimate reasons for distrusting them. You may not know how to communicate what's going on with you. You may be worried about what happens if it's in your medical record. And you may just not feel like a formal diagnosis is important, although that doesn't seem to be especially common. I've polled people, and it looks like most people would want an evaluation if they could be sure that it would be good. They just have a lot of reason to doubt that right now the outcome will be worth the effort. And if you belong to certain groups, it can be even harder. Women and people assigned female at birth are especially likely to get brushed off if we've learned to conceal our differences, and some of the differences may be more subtle to start with. Men can also have the more subtle or hidden characteristics, and women or people assigned female may have more stereotypical characteristics, but on average, these are the differences that we're finding in the research. And we know that racial bias is an issue, but it's so neglected that I don't even have studies on adults. We know that children of color are more likely to be overlooked, and I can't imagine that it's much better for adults. So after going over all that, what if you still want an evaluation? Some people find it really valuable. And it can give you some important insights, like I learned a lot from having my memory tested, and a lot of us are going to doubt ourselves until it's official. If you are just paying cash for an assessment, it's usually a few $1,000s. I can't tell you how much your insurance will pay for. You'd have to contact them and ask. If you have Medicaid, they'll usually pay 100%. Not a lot of autism specialists take Medicaid, but there are some who do. And finally, programs like the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation may pay for an evaluation. They offer a lot of really impressive resources, actually. So if you're in Washington and need any help with employment, I would suggest going and getting signed up. Here's how I've done my adult evaluations, and I think that most places will be similar, but you may see some differences from doctor to doctor. They're going to interview you about what you're like now and what you were like when you were younger. They'll probably want input from a second person, ideally someone who knew you well as a child, but occasionally that wasn't available for some of my clients, and I was still able to be confident that the person was autistic. So if you don't have anyone, then you aren't necessarily out of luck. If it is the case that you don't have a parent or someone else who can talk about how you were as a child, then it can help sometimes if you can track down information about your childhood, like report cards or videos or family stories about unusual things that you did. They'll probably do IQ testing, and that gets a bad rap sometimes because it can be biased or misleading. But the IQ testing can also be very informative about your strengths and weaknesses, like showing if you have a strong vocabulary, but a big weakness in your memory. And most people will do the ADOS-2, the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which has you doing various activities like telling a story from pictures to look at how you think and communicate. And that one also gets a bad rap, especially as being biased against women or people assigned female. But I do find that the activities still give a lot of useful information, as long as the person isn't too caught up in comparing the client to the autism stereotype. And they'll probably have you and maybe your other person fill out some questionnaires. Then there's usually a final meeting where they tell you what diagnoses and recommendations they're making. Some people find it nerve-wracking. Some people find it fun. A lot of the tests can be pretty interesting if you're the kind of person who enjoys puzzles. And they may also assess you for things like ADHD or learning disabilities or mental health conditions at the same time. But they might not, since lots of other people are qualified to assess those things. So if time is limited, then they may want to keep all of their focus on being thorough about the autism question. And maybe that all sounds pretty discouraging, but fortunately, there's still a lot that you can do, even if you can't get or don't want an evaluation. If you still aren't sure whether you're autistic, there are online resources to help you think about it. You do want to be careful, since sometimes these pages bring up traits that are common in autism, but also aren't totally unique to autism. So you also want to look at other diagnoses as well, like ADHD and complex trauma, and see if all of your experiences seem to be totally covered by those. But the questionnaires and discussions can be a good starting place, and of course it's totally possible to have both autism and the other diagnoses. If you need accommodations for school or work, if you aren't applying to an autism-specific program, then an autism diagnosis doesn't necessarily add all that much. If you have depression, anxiety, PTSD, ADHD, OCD, you can often get the exact same accommodations. If you suspect that you have one or more of these but you haven't been diagnosed with them, it is much easier to get those diagnoses confirmed than the autism. A lot of times, if you have a primary care doctor, then they can diagnose some of these just fine. Or you can go to a community mental health center that takes your insurance or offers low-cost services. And on the right, I've listed some of the accommodations that you can request with these other diagnoses. And Ask Jan at the bottom is a great resource for looking up other possible accommodations. Here's a list of online communities and resources that accept self-diagnosed people. This is also on the handout. And the Autistic People of Color Fund will give grants even if you're self-diagnosed. And if you're local to Seattle, you can look into these resources. Square Pegs is a meetup group for autistic people to just enjoy each other's company. And there are specialized groups like for women and for parents. Some programs like DVR may require you to have some sort of documented disability, but like I said on the accommodations slide, there's a good chance you qualify for other diagnoses that are much easier to get confirmed than autism and will probably also qualify you for services. So to recap what we've covered today, the University of Washington Autism Center absolutely supports self-diagnosis, and so does a lot of the autistic community. There are a million different reasons why an autistic person might be unable to get an evaluation or not want one. On the other hand, you may have reasons to need or want a formal diagnosis. The base price of an evaluation is usually a few $1,000s, and depending on your situation, it can be anywhere from free to full price, so you'll need to do your research if you want to get an evaluation. If you just need accommodations, it's often much easier to get them under a different diagnosis where evaluations are more available. And you can absolutely participate in the autistic community without a diagnosis of any kind. It's okay to participate in the community if you're self-diagnosed, and it's okay to participate if you aren't sure. It's okay to start exploring it and then go, actually, I think something other than autism is probably what's going on here. You haven't done anything wrong in that case. You've just been doing good work on figuring yourself out. This is all a big journey, and each person's journey is going to be unique. I hope that this webinar has been helpful in figuring out what steps might be right for you.